Some people choose to live close to danger, others have danger thrust upon them, and I've met many such people in different parts of the world. But it's those who elect to put themselves into dangerous situations who fascinate me. Why do they do it? What, if anything, are they trying to prove? Chris Bonnington stands in the tradition of those who've determined to test themselves against the elements. That's probably why he lives up here in the lakes, because believe it or not, this is British summertime. But Chris and I first met in rather more comfortable surroundings. We'd been elected as Men of the Year and were invited to the Savoy Hotel in London to receive our awards. Chris impressed me then, as he does now, with his air of quiet determination. He has a theory that adventurers have piercing eyes and a certain compulsive quality. Well, his compulsions have taken him right across the world, from Lakeland's Fells to the very summit of Everest itself. Chris Bonnington was born in London in 1934. He came from a broken home, and his early years were spent moving from place to place. On his own admission, he was shy and a bit of a loner. He failed to get into university, joined the RAF and failed a flying course. He then transferred to the army, and that didn't really prove to be the environment for him either. As a management trainee with Unilever, he wasn't the world's greatest margarine salesman, but he went on to become one of the world's most successful climbers. It was whilst visiting his aunt in Wallasey that he picked up a book of photographs of the Scottish mountains. His imagination was fired, as was his enthusiasm, and Chris was on his way to becoming one of a new breed of professional mountaineers who made a living out of climbing. His own epics have included 2 triumphs on Everest. First of all, leading a successful expedition there in 1975, and secondly, 10 years later, scaling the summit himself at the ripe old age of 50. Today, we meet him in a part of the world we both love almost above any other, at his cottage on the edge of the English lakes. You know, Chris, it's amazing how the scenery's changed in the last hour or so. I mean, just a short while ago, this field was covered with snow, and now it's changed dramatically. It's
partly, I suppose, well, the time of year, but the changes here are pretty radical. It can be a very wild place to live up here.
Yeah. Do you find it convenient to live up here? I mean, you earn your living as a freelance, and you are a long way from main centres. Is it difficult?
No. I mean, it's in some ways, I suppose, not as easy as if you lived in London.
But it must be a good place to work, a peaceful place, a place where you can get on with your writing. Where's your office?
Well, my office is actually the top, the end there, and the top window.
You're a few years older than me. I mean, but you still keep very fit. I mean, how do you keep fit these days? Because you're going on another expedition soon, aren't you?
Well, it's basically, I suppose, because I love climbing still, and most days I get out climbing if the weather's good.
Well, what would be a typical day for you up here, Chris, when you're at home?
Well, I try to get up early-ish, and when I have a very good day like this morning, I actually get up at about 5:30 in the morning, but more often it's about 7. And I get down to work at about 8-ish usually, and I spend the morning writing, or doing any other work, organising my next expedition or what have you, and then go for a run at lunchtime, or if I'm going to go climbing that afternoon, I'll work a bit later, and then about 2 o'clock in the afternoon I'll take off.
Do you think I'm too old to learn myself?
Oh yeah, never too old. But I mean, the beauty of climbing is that you can get total enjoyment out of it at almost any level. I mean, kind of everyone has their Everest.
I suppose you'll always be associated with Everest. I mean, there's this picture here of when you were there in, was it 1982?
This was...
I mean, this gives us such a marvellous view of your pathway up the mountain?
It's marvellous and sad. The 82 trip, on one level, it was one of the best expeditions I've ever been on. The four of us got on incredibly well together. I don't think there was an angry word through that entire expedition, and we were stretched to the absolute limit. We were trying to climb this northeast ridge of Everest. We were much too small a team for it, and we just climbed ourselves into a state of total exhaustion. And of course, perhaps through that it ended tragically. That's Dick Renshaw out in front, and just after that picture was taken, he actually had a heart attack. And of course it could have been fatal, but it wasn't, fortunately, and we were able to get him, or he was able to get himself down. There's no way we would have carried him down. And then Pete Boardman and Joe Tasker, of course, went back. I realised there was no way I could keep up with them. And they got beyond, the last point we ever saw them was up there. And they went round a bend in the ridge, and of course were never seen again.
Looking back on your childhood, I mean, have you always been an adventurer? Have you always relished danger?
Yes, I think I have. I mean, apparently, as a 2-year-old, I was a great tree climber. I ran away from home for the first time. I was very happy at home, but I ran away with a little girlfriend on the heath at the age of 3.5 and was apparently apprehended by the police eventually and ended up in the inspector's room, and we emptied all his milk bottles out over his desk. I was a revolting child.
You know, it took me until 15 before I tried to get away from home. I almost signed on for the Navy, and my father said, you know what you're doing? It's 18 years you're going to sign yourself away. And I said, yes, I know what I'm doing. And I got to the railway station. I opened the carriage door. At that point, he pulled me back, and it took me. You did it at 3.5. You're obviously much more advanced than I.
But I mean, you, in a way, I mean, the dangers you've exposed yourself to, I suspect, might be more frightening, more extreme than mine. Are you actually attracted to the risk side?
Well, I think, you see, the difference between us, there's obviously a certain similarity, but the difference between us seems to be that you pit yourself against the elements, and I pit myself against, in some ways, perhaps people. You're dealing, I mean, when I've seen some of the pictures of you climbing, and you're hanging on like that on the edge of a precipice, I say to myself, could I possibly face that sort of danger? But my danger has been going into a situation and facing someone who's been very unpredictable, someone whom I've not known which way they're going to jump. How do you how do you cope with danger? I mean, how do you feel in the face of it? Does it exhilarate you?
Well, I find it exhilarating, yes. But I mean, I think the difference, I mean, the actual danger, the risk side of adventure is an attraction to adventure, but it is a risk over which one has a lot of control. One's, okay, hanging by one's fingernails or one's halfway up a mountain, but one is playing a static force, if you like. Okay, it might be storming around you and everything else, but it is still not malignant. And I would have thought the vast difference between the experiences we might get into is that I am in this kind of in-control situation in which, or even if it's slightly out of control, but it is just the elements I'm fighting. But surely you very often are out of control. I mean, surely when you were in Beirut over Christmas, you must have, I mean, if they turned nasty on you, there was absolutely nothing you could do about it. Did that worry you?
It did. And I think you're right. You can only have a certain degree of control. And what I have to do is try and make a reasonable assessment of the situation within which I'm working. Recognize that there are certain factors in the situation I can plot. I know that there are going to be a range of interpersonal factors, there are going to be political factors, and there are going to be a whole range that I don't know about. But I've got to account for them and recognize that it's from those areas you can get an unpredictable spring. And then, in a sense, step into that situation with little more than, one might say, faith. Faith in one's own skill to a point, and the recognition beyond that point you have to be able to trust yourself to what will come.
But do you think you actually have is it adventurous as well as being a duty?
I don't think of it as, at the time, as engaging in an adventure, although in some ways it probably is. The reasons I've done it, I'm never really quite sure of all the reasons. I can only give a few that I think I know of. I mean, first of all, there is a certain sense of duty. You know. Secondly, I think there is something of compassion for people who find themselves in absolutely miserable situations and miserable circumstances. And certainly one goes into it with absolute determination to see this thing through and not to be beaten by impossible circumstances, or in some cases impossible people, or people who seem to be impossible. So I think those are some of the factors that I see, but I'm sure there are other things as well. But another point that interested me when you were talking, and when I've heard about and seen some of your exploits, do you, in these situations, feel fear? I mean, I've read of some of the accounts of your expeditions when you've been on a ledge in a tent, almost slipping off in the night. I think that would terrify me. How do you feel in those situations?
I think there's two levels. There's the fear of anticipation, and I think that's when I've been perhaps most afraid. I think going back further into the past, perhaps, when I was younger, perhaps doing more extreme things, which were less familiar to me. I mean, I remember before we went onto the North Wall of the Eiger, when we were about to make the first British ascent, and I was very, very frightened the night before we went on. It had a terrific reputation. I'd been on it a couple of times already. I'd been involved in a rescue, so that I knew what the danger was. But that's the kind of fear of, before you go into the boxing ring. And then, once you're in the boxing ring, in my case, on the climb, you haven't really got time for fear as such. I mean, for instance, the immediate crises that occur, I mean, a hold breaks away, you swing, you're hanging by one hand in that instant. There's a jab of adrenaline, but you are so, you're working so fast, your body's working so fast by instinct to get you into the right balanced position, to get back onto the rock, to get going, that the fear there is a kind of a stimulant. I think the more frightening moments are when you can't do anything about it. For instance, on the Ogre, which Doug Scott and I climbed together in '77, and Doug went and fell off on the top and broke both his legs. We had an absolute epic getting down. I fell off and broke my ribs about halfway down after we'd been on it for 4 days and hadn't any food. And we were then trapped, and I knew I was getting pneumonia. And we're just lying back in a storm. And I knew that if the weather didn't clear so I could get down, there was a good chance I'd die. And at that point, I knew it was happening, so I was afraid. But I think I accepted this, and I just concentrated my body on staying alive. But, I mean, would this be slightly similar to what you go through? I mean, say you're sitting out a bad hostage crisis or something like that. I mean, there must be time for you to be afraid, aren't there?
Yes, I think there are. I think I don't actually feel fear at the moment. I think I probably felt fear when I've looked back and reflected then what I've been through. And then I say, well, my goodness, perhaps that was a little bit extreme. But then one passes it off. But at the time of actually going through the problem, I haven't been acutely conscious of sensation or feeling of fear. But I'd be interested to know if you've got an answer to the question. Can you say why you put yourself through this type of experience?
I think optimism, in the sense that when I think the basis of my climbing is actually just sheer physical enjoyment of the sensation of climbing and the excitement of playing a danger game, which I think is mildly addictive. And most of it is terrific physical fun. And if you get onto a very hard climb and you're on top of it, the sense of exhilaration is colossal. But I think then something you want to find out, push limits further and further and further. And I don't think it's a kind of a pushing myself to the absolute limit to see how I tick. It's much more a kind of, it's a scale of a challenge. And in the same way, when the going gets really rough, just as you say, you don't want to be beaten. You want to get there. Yeah. But I think at the same time, I don't know whether it's the same for you, but as a climber, you need, yes, to finish the climb, you need a level of determination, a level of drive, a level of single-mindedness. But at the same time, if you want to stay alive, you also have got to know when to turn back. And when I've pushed something to the absolute limit, and then it's been too dangerous, and so we've decided, no, this isn't on, and we've turned back, I've never had the faintest feeling of regret. And where you regret something is when you say you've only given it half your effort, and you actually, when you came back, you think, oh, I freaked out there. Mm. Or if I just pushed it a bit more, we might have done it. And then I feel a sense of dissatisfaction.
Well, perhaps you might be saying another way, you know, the man who would succeed, or the woman who would succeed, has also got to know when to make a strategic retreat.
Oh, yes. And I mean, in your negotiating, I bet you do that.
That's happened to me on more than one occasion, where one's had to make a strategic retreat, but you make it knowing full well that you'll come back at the problem from another angle. One of the things that's also moved me quite a bit is the accounts you've given, both verbally and in some of your writings, of your experiences when you've lost colleagues on the mountain. What feelings cross your mind then? How do you cope with the fact that here you've been with a small team, you've been together, you've lived together, you've become friends, or you've established a unique bond, a unique relationship, and then one day you say goodbye to them, and that's that. How does that affect you?
Well, it doesn't get any easier. It's, I mean, when immediately an accident's happened, and I mean, on 4 of my expeditions, we have had people die. And there's a sense of immense grief, but funnily enough, at the time when it's happened, for instance, in '82, when Pete and Joe were lost, and firstly, you didn't accept that it had happened, especially when they just vanished, and therefore, right to the end, you were just hoping, against all logic, that they were going to come back. And the days went by, and your logic told you that, no, they were definitely dead, but you still kind of had this make-believe that they'd be coming back. And therefore you kept quite jolly. But even when the accident is absolutely final, I mean, for instance, when Mick Burke died in the '75 Everest expedition, when he was going with the summit, and we knew he was definitely dead, perhaps if someone had come into our little group, they'd have said, God, what a callous lot and so-and-so's. They're laughing. They seem to be carrying on exactly as if nothing had happened. And of course, this is your group mechanism. It's a way of survival as much as anything else, to actually cope with the grief that's underneath. And I think the hardest thing, though, is when you go back and you've somehow got the news through to the next of kin that their husband, boyfriend, daughter or son is dead, and you've then got to go and tell them exactly what happened. And the intensity of grief is something that they experience. And I know it's something I find very difficult to talk about, because I've experienced it myself, because our youngest child, our first child, died in an accident. And from this, one knows there is a difference between friendship and the next of kin, your child, your wife. and that therefore I'm intensely conscious of the cruelty of the grief that the parents, that the wives have, and that I, as a friend of Pete or Joe or whoever it happens to be, yes, I'm deeply sad, but it is still, it goes through several layers, but only a fraction of the number of layers that it goes through to the people who are very close, who really loved that person. And I think that is the hardest thing for me to go through, to try to help them and watch them, the cruelty of that grief. And I equate it with the grief that I experienced, and I know that one never totally gets kind of through it, of actually losing someone who is that close to you.
This experience which you referred to is something which increasingly has happened to me in recent years. I mean, I've got to the point now of jumping when the telephone rings. I was in Canada just a few weeks ago, and a message came through that a colleague of mine with whom I'd worked for years in Uganda, and who was very active in trying to bring about reconciliation in that country, his car was stopped. He was taken out, he was shot, killed. That was that. And I could repeat those experiences, far too frequently. How do I react? I think, in a sense, it's very difficult, because I think I put across myself several layers of almost shrugging it off and say, oh, I'm going on. And yet, I don't want to do that, because I know that if I do that, I actually, how do I put it, lose something of a sensitivity to myself and to other people that I don't want to lose. And yet sometimes one can't bear that degree of sensitivity, and so you have to wrap it round a bit. You know what I mean?
Yes, and presumably with you as well, though, you have, once again, I suppose you have you're clinging to a hope that you are going to be able to rescue that person, but you've also got to cope with, the desperate stress that there must be for, once again, the next of kin of the person who has been kidnapped, who is imprisoned, or what have you, who are sitting helpless, waiting, and who presumably, some of them, year after year, have got to fight this worry, the glimmering hope, I suppose, a little bit like us with Pete and Joe, that their husband or son is going to come back to them, when in fact the chances of him getting back is less and less.
The strain on hostage families is absolutely appalling, and one can't help but feel, the heavy responsibility that rests on one's shoulders, because you know that people do pin their hopes on you. For the moment, in the latest crisis in the Lebanon, month in, month out, almost becoming now year in, year out, the families in America have waited. Their hopes have been raised, and then they've been dashed. We hold on to life, and part of the reason why I've kept out of the public eye in the last month has been to try and let the situation remain quiet while everything around is so volatile, so dangerous. But the strain on the families is absolutely appalling, and it's a cruel business to deprive the innocent of their liberty. A very cruel business indeed. But how does your wife cope with this? How does she face up to the fact that you're going out, in a sense, for adventure, doing something that fulfills you, and you yourself may fall victim of an accident?
Oh, she's a very special lady.
She is.
You've seen.
I like her very much.
But no, I think she is a very, very strong person, and she's a very positive person. I think Wendy, through the strength of her own interests and her own positiveness, realizes how important that climbing whim of mine is. I mean, it's part of me, that drive, and she's prepared to, well, she gives me total backing in what I do. But I'm afraid I'm the selfish one.
But I don't think I want to take either any claim to any false moral pride or moral sense. All right, it may be acceptable, in my case, to the public at large to do what I do. But deep at the bottom of it, you know, I needn't do it.
You must actually, I mean, in the same way, I think, how much of the year, for instance, are you away?
Looking back, we were discussing this the other day, and looking back, 1 year I was away an awful long time. I'm almost ashamed to say it, 9 months of the year, solidly away. It's evened out a lot now. It's now a week here and a week there. But of course you go sometimes and you just don't know. I mean, you just don't know. It could be several weeks. You could be trapped up in a situation. Could be taken hostage yourself.
How does your wife cope with it?
I think she's become accustomed over the years to living with someone who doesn't necessarily fall into accustomed patterns, into 9-to-5 patterns. And I couldn't do that, no more than I think you could.
Do you think your own relationship, for instance, and your own marriage has perhaps benefited from the very kind of irregularity of your life, the lack of...
I think my unpredictability, my shooting off in directions and following intuition is very difficult to live with. I don't think I'm a very easy person in those respects. I think can be quite difficult, quite intense at times, and quite a complicated person to live with. There are some people out there who've been fairly critical and in some cases a little bitter about your style of leadership. How do you personally react in the face of criticism? Do you care what people think about you?
Oh yeah, but everyone cares. But I think on the whole, I think inevitably if you do anything like this, especially if you stick your neck out as a leader, you're going to have critics. I think I've done reasonably well as a leader in that I've always managed to keep my teams together. I've been accused of all kinds of things, some of them with some justice. I'm a shocker at changing my mind. I get very enthusiastic about something and then I see another possibility and I can jump slightly too acutely. And that's, that's a fault. But everyone has faults.